The Second World War ended in the year 1945. And in the aftermath of the war, its death and destruction, there was felt a need to create an organization to ensure and maintain world peace. And thus was born the United Nations. Therefore, let us understand about the United Nations organization by understanding the formation of the United Nations, its basic core structure, and also see the United Nations through an overview discussion. The first question that comes to our mind is, what is the United Nations? As per definitions are concerned, the United Nations is an international or an organization which deals with different nations and interaction between different nations, and intergovernmental, or the governments of different nations coming together. So the United Nations is an international and an intergovernmental organization which aims to maintain international peace and security, achieve international cooperation by developing good relations between the different member states, ensure fundamental human rights, the basic rights that are available to every single human being since birth, and finally, enhancing the economic and cultural development of the world. But why was the United Nations as an organization formed in the first place? Well, to understand that, we have to go to the end of the Second World War. The Second World War encountered the deaths of 75 million people and left countless others diseased, injured, and in a broken mental condition. The Second World War, in many ways, was much more disastrous and destructive than the First World War. An accurate estimation cannot even be possibly made on how much property was devastated in the Second World War. The cities that were destroyed were barely recognizable, and the economies of many countries were left in shambles. Quite simply put, the Second World War caused immense death and destruction. And this made the world come to a realization that if a third world war breaks out, there would not be a world to save at the end of it. This is because a third world war would lead to a complete wipeout of the entire human civilization and the extinction of mankind. Therefore, a need was felt to make sure such a situation is never repeated where such death and such devastation occurs. A need was felt for an organization which gives new hope to the world, an organization which works to ensure and maintain world peace. The end of the Second World War was not just marked by record-breaking death and devastation. There was a critical threat to world peace in the aftermath of the Second World War, and that was because of the international tension caused by the Cold War that existed between Soviet Russia and the United States of America. Now, because of this Cold War, which was an ideological conflict, the world was divided into two parts or two blocks, each block led by either Soviet Union or the United States of America. Now, the suspicion and distrust between the two blocks created global tension and brought the world almost an inch away from war. Yet again, a need was felt for an international organization, but this time an organization which would be neutral and which would be fair and also representative of all the nations of the world, in which all the nations can come together and bring this Cold War to an end and create agreements between the United States of America and Soviet Russia. In this picture, we see the US President Nixon and the Soviet Premier Brezhnev signing an agreement, and that too was the result of a United Nations conference. But did an organization for the maintenance of world peace already not exist? Do you remember what that organization was called? That's correct, the League of Nations. But what happened to the League of Nations? The League of Nations failed in its purpose. That is because the main purpose of the League was to prevent any further warfare, but a Second World War still took place. Now, in the failure of the League of Nations, there was a vacuum where people all around the world and all the countries felt that a new organization needs to replace the League of Nations, and this needs to be effective, strong and able, which would be able to take on all the responsibilities and roles of the League of Nations and execute them better so that the next organization does not end up in an epic failure like the League of Nations did. Finally, the creation of an organization which could maintain world peace in the aftermath of the Second World War was more of a now or never situation. You see, the Second World War came to an end when the United States of America dropped 2 atom bombs on Japan. It was not the end of the war, but the death and destruction caused by these atom bombs, which left the entire world in shock. After the end of the Second World War, the nations did not discard their nuclear weapons. Instead, there was more research and development to make the impact of these weapons even deadlier. Thus came a situation where every country wanted to have its own nuclear weapons and wanted to stockpile the maximum amount of them. This therefore led to a period of nuclear stockpiling of different nations. Now, can you imagine what would have happened if different nations would have launched their nuclear weapons at the same time? Don't bother to imagine, because by the time you end your thought, the entirety of mankind would have been wiped off. Now, this was an impending threat to mankind because for the first time, a single weapon was capable enough to destroy modern civilization. And thus, the need for an organization was felt which would ensure that the new developments of deadly nuclear weapons are not used. There is a disarmament of nuclear weapons so that the extinction of mankind could be averted. And thus, in this background, rose the United Nations organization. Now that we understand for what reason the UN was formed, let's understand how the UN was formed. The impetus for the formation of an organization like the United Nations already existed between the nations, as there was a consensus that such an organization needs to exist. But what was really required at that point of time was for all the nations to come together and to achieve the formation of this organization. This finally happened when the representatives of 50 nations, under the behest and conduction of the allied nations, namely the United States of America, Soviet Russia, United Kingdom, and France. So under the leadership of these allied nations, the representatives from 50 nations, they met at Yalta, which is in the Soviet Union, on 25th April 1945. This was known as the historic Yalta Conference. Now, the purpose of this conference was to create a roadmap or a plan of action for the future of the post-war world. And in this conference, there was an official consensus where all the nations realized that they need a new peacekeeping organization. And thus, the foundation of the spirit of the United Nations was laid down in this Yalta Conference. Now, over here we see the major allied nations and their leaders, namely Winston Churchill of United Kingdom, Roosevelt of United States of America, and Stalin of Soviet Russia. They were the ones who conducted this Yalta Conference, and under their leadership all these nations came together. And over here we see that all the nations are coming together and are realizing that they need a new world peacekeeping organization. With the foundation of the United Nations already laid out in the Yalta Conference, now representatives from 51 nations convened at San Francisco in the United States of America in the very same year with a new purpose. And the sole purpose of this particular meeting was to draft a charter of this new world peacekeeping organization, which was to be given the name of the United Nations Organization. Now, the charter was supposed to be the constitution of the United Nations Organization. It was supposed to embody its spirit and its functions, a document which lays out its rules, objectives, aims, and goals. And thus started the work on the drafting of the Charter of the United Nations Organization when all these 51 nations and the delegates met at the San Francisco session. Finally, the United Nations Organization came into existence on 24th October 1945, as you see over here, the first session of the United Nations. The United Nations came into existence when the UN Charter was ratified or accepted by major nations such as China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States, along with all the other nations signing the Charter. Now, we will understand why these nations were the major nations and they got to ratify the Charter as we go along with the subsequent lessons in this chapter. But with the ratification, the United Nations officially came into being. 24th October was the date when the UN Charter was ratified and accepted, and therefore every year 24th October is celebrated as the United Nations Day to commemorate the very event of the United Nations Charter coming into effect, and to also remind further generations as to how the majority of the world came together with the purpose of forming a world peacekeeping organization. And therefore, do not forget to celebrate United Nations Day this 24th October and make sure you add it to your calendars. Now, can you answer this question? Which day is celebrated as the United Nations Day every year? 24th October, 24th September, 24th December, or 24th August? The correct answer happens to be 24th October. Now that the United Nations was formed, a question came up. Which other nation can become a member of the United Nations organization? The answer was simple. Any peace-loving country, any state or peace-loving nation state which agrees to abide by the principles of the UN Charter is free to become a member. Therefore, the only qualification a nation needs to fulfill to join the UN is to love peace and to also be ready to accept and abide the principles of the UN Charter. Any other country can be admitted to the UN by the General Assembly, which is the legislative organ of the UN, but that has to happen upon the recommendation of the Security Council. The Security Council is the executive wing of the United Nations. We will see both of these organs in the subsequent lessons of this chapter. What we understand is the Security Council plays a very important role in giving admission and also refusing admission to different nations. The United Nations began with 51 member states, but over time more peace-loving nations kept on being admitted into the UN. Currently the UN stands with a membership of 193. To put that number into perspective, the current number of nations in the world are 195, of which 193 are part of the UN. You can see this map as to how slowly and slowly the entirety of the world map is being engulfed and becoming a part of the United Nations. UN therefore truly is United Nations, as it truly represents the entirety of the world. But an organization like the UN, which has 193 member nations and such a wide array of functions, how does an organization like that function? Who keeps the entire organization running? How is the administration of this behemoth of an organization organized? That administration of the United Nations is being given to the administrative wing of the United Nations, which is known as the Secretariat. And the person who heads the Secretariat is known as the Secretary General of the United Nations. The Secretary General is elected for a 5-year term. And as mentioned, they head the administrative wing of the United Nations. Often the Secretary General is known as the Chief Administrative Officer of the United Nations. The Secretary General is part civil servant or administrator and part diplomat. And the Secretary General is the symbol of the United Nations. And in himself, he combines the roles and functions of the organization itself. The current Secretary General is Antonio Guterres, who hails from the country of Portugal, and he has held the position since 2017. Now, apart from heading the administrative wing of the United Nations, the Secretariat, the Secretary General has many other functions. The first of them being overseeing the peacekeeping operations of the UN. The peacekeeping operations is when the United Nations sends its peacekeeping troops to different conflicts of the world. And those peacekeeping troops and their operations have the oversight of the Secretary General himself. Next, he drafts important reports and studies, and these reports and studies are then submitted to the General Assembly or other UN organs and agencies for their consideration and also for their acknowledgement. Next, he also mediates in international disputes. Now, since the United Nations acts as a mediator between two parties of a dispute, and since the Secretary General is the symbol of the UN, he acts as the mediator or the dispute resolution, thus making him the UN's top diplomat as well. And finally, he is the one who organizes the various United Nations conferences. So thus, these are the most important functions of the Secretary General. Now, the United Nations organization is headquartered, or it has its headquarters in New York City, which is in the United States of America. Now the question might come up, if New York is in United States of America, therefore does the United Nations also get control by US authorities? That's not the case. That is because the UN headquarters is built in international territory, which puts the UN headquarters building and its premises beyond the reach of US authorities' jurisdiction. Thus, the United Nations is built in international territory, giving it its own jurisdiction and freedom. But an organization the size of the United Nations cannot simply operate out of one single building. That is why, apart from the headquarters, the UN also has 4 major offices in different parts of the world. The first main office is in Geneva, over here, which is in Switzerland, and this acts as the European headquarters of the United Nations. The next main office is in Vienna, in Austria, and this houses many important United Nations offices. The next one is in The Hague, which is in Netherlands, and this primarily acts as the headquarters of the International Court of Justice. And finally, the 4th main office is located in Nairobi, Kenya, and as the greenery around the building can indicate, this acts as the coordinating center for the United Nations Environmental Program. Now, apart from its headquarters and main offices, the United Nations, its various organs, agencies and associate bodies have in total around 150 offices all around the world. That is perhaps why the United Nations is often called as a world government. Now, over here we see the flag of the UN. Aren't you curious to know what does the flag really mean? Now, this here is the flag of the United Nations. We see a white symbol against a light blue background, and perhaps it's one of the most recognizable symbols of the modern world. Now, over here we see 2 elements. One is a world map, and the other is an olive branch which is encircling the world map. The focusing on the world map showcases the focus region of the United Nations, the entire world, and the olive branch, which symbolizes peace, therefore represents the true aim of the United Nations, to achieve and maintain world peace, or the peace of the entire world. The United Nations has 6 official languages. They are English, Arabic, Chinese or Mandarin, Spanish, Russian, and French. All documents are automatically translated into these 6 official languages. However, the bulk of the work done in the United Nations is done in 2 working languages, English and French. In this lesson, we were able to understand the formation, the idea behind the United Nations. We also were able to trace the basic structure of the UN and have an overall understanding or an overview of what the UN truly is. In the next lesson, we will be focusing on the aims, objectives, and principles of the United Nations. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at deltastep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it is rewarding too. So register for free now.